Some photographers document the world as it is. Others create a space where the world feels reimagined, tender, layered, and filled with possibility. Stephanie Pommez's work lives in that space. Her portraits are intimate and theatrical at once. Rooted in collaboration, they often center young people navigating identity, vulnerability, and transformation. Whether photographed in quiet interiors or carefully constructed environments, her subjects feel present, not posed for spectacle, but invited into a shared act of storytelling. Over the course of years, Stephanie has built bodies of work that blur the line between reality and imagination. Her images are cinematic without losing authenticity. They are gentle without being fragile. They ask us to reconsider how we see youth, neurodivergence, difference, and belonging. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. Well, Stephanie, welcome to the show. It's really great to have you. Your project is really beautiful and informative in many ways. But it's been a project that you've been working on for a very long time. And in doing my research, the people here, and if you can pronounce the name of the peoples that live along the Amazon, because I think it's Ribeñeros or something like that.
Yes,
okay,
which means
you say it better than I do. Okay, your Portuguese is going to be better than my English at times. But tell me about your first sort of awareness of these people when you were growing up. What did you hear about them, even way before you decided to, become a photographer and document their lives?
Enchanted ones. So I guess, like I mentioned, I grew up in Brazil. I'm not originally from Brazil. So my parents are French, and then they moved to Canada. I was born in Canada, in Montreal, and then they moved to Brazil. And then when we got to Brazil, I did, different school systems. Like I went to the Brazilian school, then I went to the French school, then I did both at one point, and we kind of moved around a lot. And then eventually at international school. And but anyway, so but you wouldn't hear much about the Ribeirinhos, and you definitely would not hear about women. And so I was curious to know who are the women, and how do they live, and what do they believe in, and how can I discover that? And the interest came from, I think I was always interested in trying to understand different forms of life, like different approaches to life, and what comes out of that, different meanings that come out of that. So anyway, initially I was like, okay, I want to know who the Ribeirinho women are, but it was very wide as a topic, and then eventually it kind of narrowed down to the midwives. So the thread of the story that eventually led to the Enchanted Worlds was to understand who are the midwives, the traditional midwives, and what is their role? And that was the beginning of it.
In the United States, the Native American peoples, because of colonization and just being largely shifted from their native lands into reservations and other things like that, there was sort of an experience where their natural historical way of life was basically eliminated. In Brazil, along the Amazon River, you have people who are still living the way that ancestors did for hundreds of years, and so there isn't that disconnect that exists here in the United States. When you were coming up, and even now, how are people who live in more urban centers sort of look at these people, or what are their attitudes towards them? Mm-hmm.
But then the other part of it was I didn't want to romanticize it either. Right. The reason why the logistics and the person that's going to come with you and then going back. And then there's also, one of the reasons why women would choose traditional midwives is, first of all, so, it's hard to get to a clinic. And then also when you do have access to a clinic, there is, oftentimes, a cultural gap between the doctor or the nurse and the woman who's there, to give birth, and with the midwives too. If they choose to accompany a woman there's definitely a gap and a misconception of what they're doing, and sometimes
right. It happens here in the United States, but I think the modern medicine, for lack of a better word, doesn't necessarily incorporate cultural sensitivities in terms of the training they provide doctors and nurses and all the people that they train. And it seems like that lack of that really probably dissuades a lot of young women to seek out the services because of how they may feel that they are going to be understood or treated. Are the women who serve as these midwives, is it a generational thing? A mother teaches a daughter who in turn teaches her daughter, or, how do people come to fulfill those roles in their respective communities?
I'm thinking of a specific midwife when I'm saying that, Donna Dorca, but she would bring her granddaughter with her and just sort of, teach her and say, okay, well, when you're touching this way, what do you feel? And where's the baby? And then I'm thinking of another one, Donna Anunciação, like her mom was also a midwife, right? But then a lot of stories are about women who find themselves in a situation where they are alone, and maybe there's, the younger daughter who's there, or maybe there's the neighbor or another woman in the house, and then it kind of begins by necessity. But what I do find beautiful is that it may start that way, but they always go back to describing it as a dom de Deus, which means like a gift of God, and then they continue that, tradition.
In looking at the work and reading about it, it was really interesting to get a much greater sense of their roles, because it's not just that they show up on the day of the birth. They're there, helping provide prenatal care, postnatal care, serving as counselors. I mean, they're doing a lot more than just helping a woman give birth on that day.
And also give advice.
Yeah. You've been working on this project for a while, and access to some of those communities was not easy. It was not like you could just drive up to their communities and start making photographs. But how did you gain entry to the community, and what was involved in gaining their trust to make this collaboration happen?
Rice and beans.
You mentioned earlier about not wanting to romanticize this.
Yeah.
And when you're an outsider coming into a community like this, one of the things, in order to be able to prevent doing that, is a certain degree of self-awareness. And sometimes that inherent bias that you may have is not something that's really conscious, right? And especially since you're working on this project long term, there were probably sort of opportunities to sort of recognize your own blind spots and then correct for them. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
I think in general, I try to be non-judgmental and open-minded, and kind of go with the flow of how things show up without like a preconceived idea. I try as much as possible. But I think, of course, you are the product of, your culture, where you grew up and all that stuff. I don't think the best way to answer that is I didn't realize when I went in how crucial their role was in I did not see them as guardian of life and culture when I went in. I saw them as...
Okay. Yeah, because it's interesting, because the first iteration of this project was probably more sort of straightforward documentary. But in this iteration, when the Enchanted Ones, you incorporate a lot of the mythology that is part of that storytelling, that is part of that, that is part of the historical background of a people. Tell me about incorporating that and how you came to approach it in the way that you did in the book.
And in this
Right.
group, and so I started telling her about the different stories, and so the enchanted ones are the encantados, and encantados are beings that live, in the forest or underwater, and they're animals that can morph into human shape and interact with people in a either benevolent or malevolent way. They're not good or bad; they just are, and sometimes their world will blur with our real world, so like the imaginary and the real kind of become one single experience. But they're very revealing of a lot of things. And one thing I thought was really beautiful about myths is that, especially stories that are, shared orally, is that they go through generations, right? Of like the same story or the same characters, but different versions of that story or experience. For instance, the Boto is he's a native dolphin of the region, and he's a extremely known character. He will turn into the shape of a man, of a very handsome man, and seduce women, and and either bring them back to the bottom of the enchanted world, or leave them behind pregnant, or so sometimes it can be more of a romantic story, oftentimes more on a violent side, but he's a very known character, and I've yet to meet someone who does not have either themselves an encounter with a boto or know of someone who does, right? And so what I think is really
in learning about the boto, it was really fascinating how he is used to sort of diffuse tensions that could arise because of unintended pregnancies, circumstances, there are myriad of, but that could create tensions within not just a family group, but within the whole community. And that the existence of the boto and the story of the boto is a way that those tensions can be diffused even now.
There's, violence within the family or within that community or with neighbors. And the reality is that there's not going to be accountability for that. And those were not stories of boto, but those were stories where I was there and I could see what had happened, and I could see what would come out of it, right? Which is, how do you move on, right? And what are your options? And then how do you move forward? And it's true that the boto does certainly become a way to kind of diffuse, these tensions or violence that can happen, and allow for everyone, including, the woman, to move on. It's true that there are other stories of encantados which can explain and allow for some way to move forward. When you hear stories of, she was pregnant for a year from a boto, and then the tucuxi, which is another form of dolphin, was born, and the midwife had to release it into the water and let it go, bless it and let it go, right? Which also stories that bring some relief to loss. I can think of many other stories that are like that, of giving birth to, a cobra grande. Cobra grande is a serpent from the river who can also seduce, right? And sometimes women can give birth to a snake, right? And then sort of again, like, what does that mean? It means you're trying to deal with a situation that you may not have the words to explain what happened, but you're trying to bring relief. So the boto definitely plays that role, as do a lot of the enchanted beings. And they also explain sometimes it's related to birth, sometimes it's not related to birth, sometimes it's related to, someone, like mentally decide, someone in a very difficult position who decides to let go of life, right? And go into the river and not come back, and leave to the enchanted world. So there's definitely that side of it.
If you're ready to take your photography to a deeper, more personal level, while exploring one of the most visually rich places in the world, I invite you to join me for my upcoming Spring 2026 workshop in Japan. I'll be leading a small group through Nobechi Creative's immersive program, designed to challenge and inspire photographers who want more than just postcard images. You can learn more and reserve your spot by visiting nobechicreative.com. I'm also partnering with F8 Photographic Workshops for additional international experiences, including a return to Vietnam. These workshops go beyond technique. They're about developing your vision, strengthening your voice, and making photographs that are deeply personal and meaningful. For more details, visit f8photographicworkshops.com. You produced this project on film as opposed to using digital. Why that choice, and what challenges did you face shooting where you were using that kind of gear?
For sure.
When you recognized that you wanted to incorporate the idea of the Encantados into the project, how did that evolve sort of in terms of your approach, both in terms of how and what you were shooting, but then later on when you were designing the book, how you were going to express that on paper?
Tribute.
Because the book can serve as a sort of not more than just a document, but can be also, what's the word I'm looking for? Experiential, where even that the people come away with a feeling rather than just an observation. And I think that's what you were striving for with the use of those overlays in the book.
Entirety of the book exists, with that in mind. So the sequence of the story begins with, the book begins with a short text that kind of allows for a shift in your mindset, so that now you're on a river. There's the paddling of the canoe. You're with Dona Zenilda, one of the midwives. You're going in Igarapé, which is a tribute, a smaller river, and then you're there, and then stories begin. And then the opening page is an overlay of a closed eye over a river, and the story is contained between that image, which kind of brings you to the idea of, this is a sort of a dream, or is it an inner journey, or what is it? And the last image, which is the continuation of the river back to when the blurring of worlds has stopped. And in between that is the story is contained, and it's a story. It's not documentary work. It's based off as the material is documentary photography, but it's worked differently in terms of its sequence, in terms of, there are also some silk sheets that, are placed next to an image of the midwife doing a blessing over a child, just stepping over a child and in an entranceway. And so it's one side of her and then the other side. And in between, there are like these silk sheets that talk about, the ephemeral, the, things that are sort of flowing through. And the same is the role of the light through. It's almost like a character of its own. They came to visit me is the beginning of of the book, and there's this light that keeps traveling through all these different places, right? And and then the cover also plays a role. So even the shape of the book, it's not rectangular; it's a square or square-ish, which indicates like, okay, well, this, you think of documentary work, you think more of a rectangular shape. This is not it. This is square. So it's, more like a story of its own, like another world, something different. And then the back of it is this organic, chocolate colored texture that has a plant-based feel to it, but also wood feel to it. And it's kind of, the front is inside a house, and with the little girl and the monkey on her lap, that's very restful, and it's sort of like, okay, like these worlds will merge now. The story is being told within this house, which is oftentimes how stories are shared. You're kind of all sitting around on the floor, and you're having coffee and talking and sharing stories, and it begins there, and then it is contained within the river images that I mentioned. And then when you first open it, the sort of powder pink color of it is also a reference to, fables and stories, but it's also a reference to the boto, which is the pink dolphin, right? Mm-hmm. And so the entirety of it is meant as in, this is a poem, or this is a fable that is contained within these pages, within this book, and the entirety of it is the story.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that it was your kind of curiosity that led you to, these people and to these midwives, and coming to understand the way that they approach birth and pregnancy and death and mythology. But, you're a person that lives in, a first world country, mm-hmm. right? Who has a very distinctly different attitudes toward the very same things. How has that, the work that you've done sort of opened your eyes to some of the assumptions that we make ourselves about the very same things that we just kind of might have accepted as, well, that's just the way it is. But when you have the perspective of going into an entirely different world and a different community, it makes you realize that, oh, that's not the way it is everywhere.
Interacting with life and those around you, how do you bring these elements into your life in a way that's going to enrich the way you see the world and see meaning, and understand that there are different meanings out there and multiple truths that can actually coexist. And and that's kind of the beauty. So for me, I see this project as that, whether it's the enchanted world that brings a way of looking at a community and how they interact with their environment and how it brings them together or allows for, life to continue, like that applies to many, many different groups, right? And so I think what changed too, I'm trying to think, it's funny, I remember, so when you're traveling through the rivers, right? So a lot of times it's just like this sort of monotonous, rhythmic, boat journey where, there's like the engine that's sort of repetitive, and then you're looking at the water, mm-hmm. and it's very similar throughout. And you don't see that much into the forest because there's like, a curtain of trees and branches, and you don't see much that's going on inside. So it's very repetitive. But then, when you start bringing new elements into the way, that come from stories that are shared or beliefs that are shared, then it starts transforming the way you look at the landscape, right? So all of a sudden you start looking at the landscape and you're like, oh, wow, actually this river at this point is the perfect mirror of, the sky above and the forest around it. And it's really hard to see where that horizon line is. And I can see how things can blur very easily between worlds, right? And maybe had I not been listening to these stories, I wouldn't have seen that. But how incredible to be able to start seeing the world that way and to start seeing, different explanations and ways of being through that angle as well. The same way that, if you spoke to, a different people who, live by the sea, and when you look at the ocean, you see, oh, it's a big wave, it's a small wave. But for that person, there are, hundreds of ways to interpret that wave, right? And so how incredible to all of a sudden look at the same body of water so differently, because now you know that there are 100 different ways of looking at that wave, and they have different meanings, they carry different meanings. And I think I've always been in search of that. When I lived in Hong Kong for about 5 years, and when I was there, I was doing more like street photography, but on the side I had a startup, and the purpose of the startup was a little bit along the same line of thinking, which was at first, I was documenting and trying to retell stories of different groups or ways of being. And then all of a sudden I was like, well, okay, well, how do we move away from that to direct experience with people so that you have a deeper knowledge of a place and of a culture and what it holds, so that those new elements in your life can change how you shape your understanding of the map of the world. And so I think it's been like a constant thread throughout my life. And the Enchanted One's another way to talk about that through myths and through the intangible, the ephemeral.
One of I talk to so many people who work on a lot of personal projects because they can't wait for some publication to say, hey, this is a great story I want you to work on. It's often self-initiated, as was the case with this particular project. But the logistics of making it happen, like as you said earlier, you're working as a professional photographer here in the States, and you're earning enough money to be able to pay for the travel and everything that you need in order to sort of make it happen. Talk to me about the logistics in terms of being able to do this, especially over a period of years.
What was I missing? And so, going back that distance allows you to go back and say, oh, I really haven't spoken about this, like for instance, one thing I think is very beautiful. They're small details, but they're details that stay with you, and you're like, oh, but I don't find that in the work that I've done. There's such a sense of dignity and an elegance in their movements. For instance, in the way they're always wearing skirts, but when they're sitting on the floor or when they're sitting in the canoe, they kind of put the leg to the side, and it's just so much beauty in that little small gesture, or in their eyes, or in how when they come and arrive to a house, you'll have the people from that house kiss the back of their hand and say bang song, like, bless me. And, this sort of respect. And is that coming across in what I'm doing? I don't know. Like, maybe I need to go back and have that in the back of my mind, because I noticed it stayed with me, but maybe I didn't, it's not here, right? It's not in what I've produced. And so that distance actually can be to your benefit, right? I think also, you kind of inform yourself and speaking to, I think sometimes you're kind of in your head a lot as a photographer. And so it's nice to be able to get away and also talk to other people and also inform yourself in terms of, what you're doing. And, you notice something, maybe you dig deeper into that before going back so that you have a better understanding of it, because you didn't know what you didn't know before, and now you do. So I think, on one hand, obviously it can be a little bit of a frustration, but I think at the same time, if it's something that you're pursuing, then there's the benefit of being able to grow along that time as well.
As you're working on the project, especially when you start, culling and editing and making choices in terms of individual images, and then later on, eventually, as you putting it together as a body of work, you often need feedback from people. Who did you come to sort of rely on in terms of being able to use as a sounding board to gauge where you were succeeding and where you needed additional work on? And how did you find those people? And what has been the reaction of the communities to the work when you've gone back and shown them?
Well, that's story.
With our cell phones, we get very spoiled in terms of being able to document our families and family life. And that's not a readily available thing. So a portrait like that can be very significant. Yeah. Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own, and it can be anyone. Someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why? Go ahead.
And she did this incredible book. I think, I want to say 2015 was when it was published, but I'm not 100% sure. But around that time, and it's called Survivors, and it's a book really beautiful, and it's about, the Armenian genocide and portraits of survivors, as well as witnessing and, their stories of, what they took with them or left behind, so I think it's a pretty important book and piece of document, especially given, Nagorno-Karabakh of late. And it's really beautiful. And she also has this group. They're called Four Plus Documentary Photography, and they have meetings of different photographers that do documentary photographers that work on current issues. So definitely her. And then someone I met at Paris Photo recently. His name is Luis Sergio, and he just published a book. He's Peruvian, but I think he's also Chilean. And he published a book called Pu Mapuche, and it's about the Mapuche people in Chile. And it's really beautiful, truly incredible work. And I love the way it was edited as well, because there's a linearity to it, but then there's an unexpected punctuations to the sequence of images. And he's just a great guy all around. So definitely look into his work. It's very beautiful.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for your time and sharing your work with us. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Stephanie for sharing her insight and her thoughtful approach to portraiture. You can explore more of her work by visiting stephaniepommez.com and discover the projects that continue to expand the language of contemporary portrait photography. And if you're a fan of The Candid Frame, please leave a review on whatever podcast app you use to listen to podcasts. And remember to use the hashtag #TheCandidFrame. You can support the show financially through Patreon or make a one-time contribution through buymeacoffee.com/TheCandidFrame. Also, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on Substack for behind-the-scenes reflections, workshop updates, and access to our growing community of photographers. Our audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibarian X, and this is The Candid Frame.